Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here for episode 101, putting out a special 2 episodes this week. Here's your second one, Hell Put to Shame by Earl Swift. Tell you what, I'm not just going to read the title, I'm going to read the whole title. You know, that subtitle that comes after. The 1921 Murder Farm Massacre and the Horror of America's Second Slavery. I don't think I need to explain much more than that. It was great talking to Earl. I'm not going to belabor the point. Let's do it. And here we are with author Earl Swift, Hell Put to Shame, the 1921 Murder Farm Massacre and the Horror of America's Second Slavery. Earl, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, listen, not a lot of this episode is going to be light, but it's really, really interesting. When did you first hear about the Murder Farm Massacre and Farmer Williams and everything that he was doing? When did you first come across this episode and decide to put it into a book?
Well, back in roughly 2006, 2007, I was researching another book, A History of the American Highway System, and I was in the library at Old Dominion University in Norfolk going through microfilm of the New York Times from 1921, looking for a 3-sentence brief that had appeared somewhere deep in the paper one day in March, and I didn't know what day, that reported the passage in Congress of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921, which we now know is the most important piece of highway legislation in American history, but was completely ignored at the time. And the whole reason I was looking for it was to demonstrate how overlooked it was, because the Times had done just this little tiny brief. But I had to find the brief. And I kept on running as I was going through, poring over each page on microfilm. I kept running into a recurring story from issue to issue talking about a murder farm in Georgia. It's not a phrase that you see very often. And so I started reading the stories. And once I read one, I just kind of followed the story, but I abandoned the Federal Aid Highway Act and just started, reading the daily coverage of this murder investigation that was underway in rural Georgia, in a place called Jasper County, 40 miles southeast of Atlanta, where a number of Black indentured servants basically had been killed. And, when I began reading these, the investigation was still underway. It wasn't exactly clear who had done the killing. But as the coverage continued, that became clear. That kind of asserted itself more and more. And I just realized, holy smokes, how is it that I've never heard of this? The stories also used a word peonage that I had never seen before, and I had no idea what it meant.
Well, you got to tell us what it means, because I bet you a lot of people have no idea.
Well, peonage is slavery, basically. It takes a number of forms, but they all have in common the involuntary incarceration, more or less, of a person by usually private parties for debt. It's been illegal in the United States since 1867, when Congress passed an Anti-Peonage Act, but it's been practiced pretty widely, or it was practiced pretty widely through World War II, and still rears its head even today from time to time. In the case of this story, the form it took, and this is not the most common form, but it was a not uncommon form in the American South of the early 20th century. A Black man would be arrested on a trifling charge, criminal charge. Vagrancy was a real popular one. If you were found without a nickel in your pocket, you could actually be arrested and hauled off to jail and put on the chain gang. And often you were burdened with a fine, $5, $10, that, given the wages of the day, there was no way in a million years you were going to be able to pay. And so right when things were looking particularly bleak and you were in the lockup and waiting to go to the chain gang, a farmer would show up in the jail and would offer to pay your fine in exchange for you coming to work for him and working off your term there. And this sounded pretty attractive to an awful lot of would-be prisoners. Everybody knew that the depredations of the chain gang were pretty extreme. It couldn't be any worse, surely, working on a plantation, doing work that you probably have done, at least for part of your life anyway. And so off these men would go with their seeming benefactors, only all too often when they got to the plantations that they'd agreed to work at, they found that they were billed for their clothes, for their food, and that was added to the fine that they had to pay off. And pretty soon they were in deeper debt than ever. And what would have been a short sentence on the chain gang became a life sentence on these plantations. And there are a great many people who spent years, decades, so imprisoned. The conditions were often worse than they had been during chattel slavery because a landowner who took on one of these peons, that's where we get the word, didn't have much incentive to treat them gently. I mean, back in the bad old days of pre-Civil War slavery, as bad as things were, a landowner, a slave owner, had good economic reason to take care of the human beings he owned. He had a huge financial investment in them. To beat a slave to death was to hurt yourself financially. Whereas 50 years later, at the height of peonage, these farmers didn't have any incentive to treat their people well because their investment in a peon amounted to the trifling fine that they paid. A $5 fine was the only investment they had. And so, if they beat a peon to death, well, they just go back down to the jail and get another peon. Once I started digging into peonage, I realized that this was a story that I was completely ignorant about. I was self-satisfied that the Civil War had ended slavery, that the 13th Amendment had put it to rest for good. And it was a bit shocking and unmooring to find that that was not the case.
Something that happened multiple times as I'm reading this is I kept forgetting that this happened in 1921. I remember multiple times where a character would get into a car and it would just completely throw me off. I said, get in a car. Because as you're reading this, you're like, this must be like 1875, right after the Civil War. But we're talking about 1921, just barely over 100 years ago. And when you say America's Second Slavery in the subtitle, you're not kidding.
Oh, that's no exaggeration. I'm not being hyperbolic there at all. This was slavery, and it enslaved tens of thousands of people. This ruined lives all through the South. And the South is, there are certainly instances where peonage was found north of the Mason-Dixon line, but they were relatively rare. The South is where you really saw this put to use. And you saw it in turpentine camps along the Georgia-Florida border. You saw it in the building of railroads. You saw it in steel mills down in Alabama. But mostly you saw it in the raising of cotton and corn all through the South, the Black Belt of the South. And that extended from East Texas all the way to the Atlantic and all along the Gulf. And came up as far as Southside Virginia, below the James River. It was widespread. It was tacitly ignored by officialdom on the state and local level. If it wasn't, in fact, involving officialdom itself, this was a serious scourge.
And now you start this particular episode off with a man walks into an Atlanta building. Who is this person? What is he there to do? And who is he going to talk to?
The man was a fellow named Gus Chapman, 39 years old, black man, who for the last close to a year had been imprisoned on a plantation in Jasper County near a town called Monticello, and who had escaped. He had been one of the rare escapees from a sprawling plantation owned by a white man named John S. Williams and operated by Williams and his grown sons. He had 12 children altogether. His oldest son was a doctor who had moved off out of the county. His next three oldest sons were basically his farm overseers. They managed his property for him. They had learned from Daddy all the tricks of running a peonage operation and operating in as cruel a fashion as possible to their fellow man. And Gus Chapman walked into this building, which at the time was the federal courthouse in Atlanta, to seek out agents of the Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner of the FBI, the DOJ's investigative arm. Sat down with two of the agents and told them that he had been held prisoner. Of course, they recognized immediately by what he was telling them that he was a peon and had been held illegally. They also, like most federal agents of the day, were loath to investigate a peonage case if they could avoid it because it was a difficult crime to prove. If you got before a jury, well, of course, in Georgia, juries were all white because blacks were prevented from voting and therefore could not serve on juries. So you're going to be trying almost invariably a white man on the testimony of black people before a white jury. And those trials ended predictably. Whites were never convicted of peonage, or damn rarely. Even if you did get a conviction, the fines were so meager that it was much ado, a lot of effort for very little payoff. And so the agents took Chapman's story, and if it hadn't been for the fact that a second peon escaped the Williams place and wandered into the Atlanta offices of the Bureau of Investigation, I wonder whether those two agents would have gotten into a car and driven the 40 miles down to Jasper County. But as it happened, the second man did walk in, and like the first, like Gus Chapman, reported that not only had he been held in peonage, but he had seen his fellow peons murdered before his eyes by John S. Williams and his sons. And so with this critical mass of testimony, kind of unable to walk away from it, these two agents took a drive down to Jasper County to meet with the plantation.
And the fact that they actually decided to follow up really kind of sets what seems like everything in motion. Because at this time, I think we think of a lot of movies where it's like everyone is in on it, everybody is crooked, no one actually wants to do the right thing. It seems like these agents actually trying to do the right thing set a lot of this, what we call massacre, into motion, right?
Yeah, they inadvertently created a monster. They visited the Williams plantation, spent a day in mid-February 1921 out at the spread. And the plantation was divided into two pieces. John S. Williams had a home place of about 325 acres where he actually lived and did some farming. But the bulk of the cotton farming was on a kind of a quilt work of spreads that he owned about 5 miles to the west on the shores of a giant reservoir, Jackson Lake. And his three sons ran that 750 acres over there. And so when the agents arrived at Williams's place, they took a look around the home place. There wasn't much to see that interested them. And then Williams escorted them to his son's properties over on the lakefront. And there they interviewed a number of peons, all of whom were too terrified to say a word. And it was clear to the agents that they were terrified. And they also saw some other things that made it clear to them that there was, in fact, a peonage operation afoot here. And I won't go into too much detail about what some of that evidence was, but the physical evidence was pretty compelling. And Williams, for his part, did his best to appear completely cooperative, at the same time assuring them that everybody who worked on his place was happy to be there, that his employees were a happy bunch. He never locked anyone up, and no one was held against their will. They could leave whenever they liked, blah, 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 blah. And the agents concluded that if they were going to put together a case against him, they were going to have to come back and figure out a way to get the peons off the property and away from the Williamses so that they could speak without fear of retribution. Before they could do that, a series of events were put into motion by that visit they had made on February 18th, 1921, that became unstoppable pretty much.
Besides Williams, the other name that we see throughout the book is Clyde Manning. Who's Clyde Manning, and how is he part of the story?
Clyde Manning was a 27-year-old black man who worked for Williams. Williams had two classes of black employee. He had peons that he bailed out of local jails, and then he had a couple of families, the Freemans and the Mannings, all of whom were cousins to each other and intermarried, and they lived permanently on the plantation, and they were regular employees who either made their living through straight wages or through a cut of the proceeds from their labors. And Clyde Manning was one of the latter, one of the permanent families. His mom lived there. His brothers, his sisters, his wife and small daughter were on the plantation with him. He had become, in the years since World War I, John S. Williams's field boss on the Williams property. So on the 325-acre home place, Williams kept another field boss for the 750 acres up by the lake. And basically, he served as Williams's eyes and ears and whip on those 325 acres. He was an enforcer of discipline. He was a whip for getting maximum work out of the men on the farm, and he was kind of a gopher for the boss.
But he also seems to almost be kind of a special case because throughout this, and there's lots of twists and turns that Manning is part of, he really kind of also holds his own. He's not somebody that's just been stuck on the farm and doesn't seem to just does what he's told. He almost seems to be pretty aware of his circumstances and is a bit of a survivor as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think, as much as it's possible for a white guy in his 60s in 2024 to try to channel what it would have been like to be a black man in his late 20s in 1921, I think that understandably, you had to be a survivor and to have a realistic look at the way of the world in the South if you were going to see 30 years old back then. It's not a happy time. This is the height of Jim Crow. in the South. This was the height, or actually it wasn't quite the height. It was mob violence against Black people had started to taper off by 1921, but only so much. It was a very dangerous time to be alive as a Black man or Black woman in Georgia in 1921. Clyde Manning was a smart guy. He was no dummy. He had no education whatsoever. Could not write his own name on his draft card from 1918. He just has a big X that he put there. But he's pretty savvy. He understands how people work. He understands how to stay on Williams's good side, or at least to avoid his bad side. I don't think he ever learned how to play the boss, but he could keep him mollified most of the time. As field boss, made him a natural recruit when Williams decided after the federal visit that those feds were going to come back and they were going to seize his farm and take it away from him. They'll probably jail him and his 3 sons, and he'd be ruined if any of those peons that he had in his employ decided to talk. Manning was a natural recruit for the effort to make sure nobody talked.
Another thread you have through this is what the NAACP is doing at this point in time in this area and things like that. Why did you decide to add the NAACP into this story? How do they kind of fit in?
Well, in some ways, they're my favorite part of the story because I was completely unaware of the NAACP's activities in the 1920s when I started out putting this project together. I'm embarrassed to say I had never heard of James Weldon Johnson, and I hang my head in shame for that, because he's one of the most remarkable figures in American history, as I found out when I did my digging, as is Walter F. White, his protege and lieutenant. The NAACP, this did not occur in a vacuum, this story, especially since World War I. Racial violence had really reached kind of a fever pitch throughout the South. And the NAACP had been extremely active in confronting it and forcing America to look at itself with clear eyes. And James Weldon Johnson, Walter F. White became important sideline figures to how this case was handled and creating a political mood in which prosecution for what happened on the Williams farm was unavoidable. This could not be swept under the rug. We tend to think of the civil rights movement as being a product of the 50s and 60s. And the fact is, the NAACP was engaged in the 1920s in civil rights work that in many ways was far more dangerous. There was not a national news media looking on while these guys went into the field to do their work. They went into the South, the place where they were needed the most, at great risk to their personal safety. This is at a time when Black lives were cheap. It took very little to provoke a mob into taking action to end your life. Once that decision was made, it was over very quickly. You didn't have time to respond even. Convinced that this story could not be told without putting the Peonage case, the murder farm case, into the context of its day. The best way to do that was through the work of the NAACP, because they had been involved in every atrocity that had come down the pike over the past several years.
One of the problems with stories like this is you're not going to get Clyde Manning writing his own memoir and things like that. And especially for everyone that was on this farm, them being able to talk about this other than in trial transcripts is probably the only way you're going to get their voice. Pulling in the NAACP, that kind of helps put these things into context too, right? To actually give Black people a voice in this area. No question. And it certainly helps that James Weldon Johnson was an incredibly gifted writer, an acclaimed poet, brilliant memoirist, and a fantastic historian, one of the organizers of the Harlem Renaissance, the guy who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing with his brother. He was a literary force to be reckoned with. So not only did he lend people like Clyde Manning a voice, but he lent them a voice for the ages. I just found him to be an amazing figure. The question I ask myself now is, how is it that I lived for 50 some odd years before I really got serious about digging into this book and putting it together without having heard of him? That's a blank spot in my education that I feel like I need to blame on somebody. But of course, I'm to blame for a piece of it. But I just don't see how this guy isn't taught in grade school. He should be up there with Harriet Tubman. He's fantastic. When I want to tiptoe around the kind of back end of the book, when we get to 2 trials, yes, 2 trials. Well, 2 men on trial, I should say. Multiple trials. 3 trials altogether, yeah. One of the things that really comes to the fore here, and I really appreciate how you handle this, is you talk about this at the very beginning of the book. A word that we are definitely not going to say on this podcast is in the book. multiple times.
Yes.
How important was it to you? And you talk about it in the beginning for anybody who wants to read your actual words, but this word, it's a bad word. We don't want to use it, but it's in the book. What made you decide that it needed to be there?
Well, that was the subject of a lot of soul searching, because when I see the word in print, let alone hear it spoken aloud, I have a physical reaction to it. It's jarring. And the thing that I found remarkable was how casual its use was in 1921, not only in the street, but in court, and among officers of the federal government. You had people who would lose their jobs in a second over that sort of thing today, but throwing the N-word around as if it was completely acceptable, which sadly it was. And that's not the only racial slur that's in here either. I mean, there are a couple of others that were used in open court. And, I really, really debated whether to include it or whether to come up with some euphemism, because the reader has a million reasons not to finish a book, and you don't want to erect any speed bumps. You want to smooth them down as much as you can and get the reader to the end of the story. But I came to feel that there was no way that you could tell a story of racial horror of this ilk and sanitize the language of the people responsible for that horror. Understanding the times in which this happened, understanding the place in which it occurred, demanded that I use the word at least occasionally. Now, I will say that I trimmed a lot of N-words out of the text. What you get of the book is a tiny sampling compared to the omnipresence of the word in documents, in newspaper quotes, in testimony from the day. Even so, a few times it does appear in the book. It causes you to catch your breath.
I do appreciate that there's multiple times where it's in there where you will take a quick aside as the author to say, yes, this is a member of the federal government who had no problem just saying it.
Yeah.
And again, not 1820, not 1850, 1921 in Georgia in open court. This is getting written down. It's just like, yeah, let me just go use some very colorful words.
We had a judge who was retired as a judge by the time he appears in the story. It was, in fact, a lawyer for the defense, I think, who at one point uses a racial slur in court. I do take the reader aside and say, remember, this is not only in court. This is an officer of the court talking. Yeah, it's shocking.
With these trials, there's a lot of twists and turns. We don't want to get into it. We talked about it before we hit record, like what we want to leave for the reader to find. Were you shocked, though, at how many twists and turns? I mean, you have witnesses who it's like they're in a movie, and this is their shot, and they just nail it, and you keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. I mean, just researching, were you amazed at how many twists and turns there were in these trials?
Oh, I was riveted. The trials are great stuff. They really are. Going into the trial what the basics of the crime are. In the way I tell the story, going into the trials, what the headlines are. The outlines of what happened. The human toll that's been exacted for that visit by the federal agents. But it's not until you get into the trial and you have multiple witnesses testifying and the details start to present themselves like an onion being peeled, one layer after another, that the full horror of what occurred really comes home. And I think that the prosecution was as blown away as anybody by the witness testimony and how detailed, how spot on these witnesses were. They were fantastic. The witness testimony is just jaw-dropping.
If I could magically put you back there and get you in a room with any one person from this book for an hour, who would it be?
Hugh Dorsey.
Who's Hugh Dorsey? Tell us about him.
Hugh Dorsey was the governor of Georgia at the time that this happened. I have to understand that this was a weird time politically all through the South. The Democratic Party of the day was the ruling party throughout the South. It's not the same Democratic Party that we have now. In terms of conservatism versus liberality, racial progressiveness versus kind of racial traditionalism, the two parties occupied the opposite roles of what they do today. So the Democrats were staunch defenders of the status quo in the South. And Hugh Dorsey was a lifelong Democratic politician, and he was an unsympathetic character for an even bigger reason, and that is that 8 years before all this happened, Hugh Dorsey had been the prosecutor in the Leo Frank case. The Leo Frank case of 1913 saw a New York-raised Jewish pencil factory manager from Atlanta prosecuted for the murder of a 13-year-old girl who worked for him and whose body was found in the pencil factory's basement. Despite evidence that he he was not the killer, despite pretty strong, very difficult to refute evidence that the chief witness against him was in fact the killer and was coached by Dorsey to put this Yankee Jew behind bars or in the gallows. We've seen recently a Broadway musical kind of enjoy a second run parade in which the principal villain is Hugh Dorsey. Any description of the case, and there have been so many books written about the Leo Frank case over the years, over the last 100 years, all of them pretty much paint Hugh Dorsey as the villain. He's a guy who quashed exculpatory evidence. He coached witnesses. He did what was necessary to get a conviction, and he got one. And then when Frank appealed his case, Hugh Dorsey did everything in his power to defeat those appeals, and he got elected governor in 1916, basically because he had been such a staunch defender of white womanhood. That's how he was kind of portrayed. So when the feds became aware that peons were dying down in Jasper County after their visit, and they realized that officials in Jasper County might not have the stomach for prosecuting one of the richest people in that county. And when they realized that they themselves had no jurisdiction in the case because murder was not a federal offense, they went to Hugh Dorsey to ask for help with probably very little expectation that they'd get a lot of traction given his past. And were very pleasantly surprised that not only did they get traction, they got a lot of it. He threw the entire weight of the state behind the investigation and prosecution of the case, and in many ways became sort of the sideline hero to the whole affair.
Goes for a full-on redemption arc.
Yeah, well, yeah, and of course, that's exactly what I would want to talk to him about for that hour. Why were you such a bastard back in 1913, and what changed? I get into theorizing about what changed in the book somewhat. Unfortunately, Dorsey never wrote about any of this himself. He left no papers. He appears to have pretty much erased any sort of documentary explanation for his life on his way out. There's just nothing to be had. And his family, tried talking to them. They profess to have no insights, no papers, and nothing that explains him. The big defense you hear of Dorsey is that, well, he really believed Leo Frank was guilty, and that's fine, but that's kind of beside the point. What is on point is that he behaved very badly to get Frank behind bars. He broke the law, in my mind, to see justice prevail.
Well, Earl, I love this book, but there are people out there who are like, oh, this is nonfiction. It's history. It sounds like it's a heavy subject. I don't, they don't want to deal with this, right? If I got one of those people and sat them in front of you and they said, why should I read Hell Put to Shame? What would you say?
I'd say that we're stronger as American citizens and as members of society when we have a good understanding of our history, not just a sanitized grade school fable about where we're from and what we've done and what's transpired over the last 248 years. The endurance of slavery past the point where we thought it ended is a pretty significant piece of history. I mean, when you consider that slavery is the original sin, it's the thing that we will have dealt with since the founding of the country, that has undermined all of our lofty ideals and our, and pronouncements, and continues to live on in its effects today. I think it behooves you to have a really firm grasp on exactly what it looked like and the different forms it took. And this was a shockingly widespread crime that we're talking about. This involved a lot of victims, a lot, to the point where I think that there were probably, if you look at the period on either side of the First World War, say 10 years on either side of the First World War, I think you'd probably be hard-pressed to find a black family in the American South who wasn't touched in some way by peonage. You'd have a son, a husband, a brother who would simply disappear without explanation for years, if you were lucky, for years.
Well, Earl, it opened my eyes up on a lot of things. It's a great book. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about it.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Earl, thank you so much for coming on. Hell Put to Shame. Amazing book. Really important story, everybody. Highly, highly recommend you read it. Hit us up on our socials, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the new YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.